Hello again, Shafinaaz.
How are you doing?
Find yourself?
Okay. Just want to change something here. The
And
lighting.
our live streaming has started. Might I just add?
I just want to make sure the lighting is fine,
Okay, that's
but
fine.
I'm ready.
Um, Welcome everybody once again to the Africa for Palestine webinar series. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for following this series from last year. Today we are joined by another special guest, Shafinaaz Hassim. She is a South African author, a sociologist, and she has written a number of novels and a number of think pieces on several issues in South Africa and internationally. Hello, Shafinaaz, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Great to be on your show, Ali.
Well, thank you for honoring our invitation once again. To our audience, those who are not familiar with our work, we are Africa for Palestine. We are a Palestine human rights solidarity organization based in South Africa that does work in the African continent. We partner with many organizations, from political parties to faith-based organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues. We work with student activists on campuses on various issues, academic boycotts of Israel and others. We work with the trade union movements in the continent. We've worked with grassroots-based movement in villages. We've worked with civic movements in cities. And the broader civil society organization in the continent we work with, but particularly those who identify with our cause. We have started this webinar series last year during the lockdown period. We've had different guests from different walks of lives on this webinar series to speak about different topics. We've had academics, we've had trade unionists, we've had student activists, we've had faith-based leaders, we've had authors and artists on this webinar series speaking about very many different things. We've had many people from different parts of the world to speak about issues in Swaziland, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Palestine, and in many other parts of the world where there's oppression. Um, Today we are joined by Shafinaaz Hassim, as we've introduced her. Welcome to the webinar series. We've been waiting to have this discussion with you regarding being an author and an activist. Um, just to kick things off on a lighter note, just let us know with our audience how has this journey been for you to be a writer, to be an author? Is it something that you've always known you wanted to do? Is it something that fell in your lap? Is it something that was a calling? How's been the journey?
I think it is something that I always thought I'd be involved in. Early, in my early years, when I was maybe about 8 or 9 years old, my dad encouraged me to keep a travel journal. So whenever we went anywhere on a holiday that was like the very, very first sort of learning the discipline of writing a daily line or a weekend story or anything about travel or that sort of thing. So I think I always had that passion for reading and writing. And you have to be a reader if you want to be a writer. We process life through what we read, and reading is an experience of its own. So yeah, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I just didn't envisage that I'd be a published writer, an author. Because back then we were reading material that came from so many different countries, but not a lot of material we could identify with personally. And we were limited to what we had access to back when I was growing up. I even remember, I think I had a language teacher. So in our ghetto schools, for the languages, they would get a teacher. I grew up in a small town in Limpopo, what was then called Petersburg. And so for your language teachers would come from some of the other schools, from the white schools. And I remember telling the teacher, I think one day I'm going to write a book. And she said, but books are written by people who come from London and places like that, you know? And I think about it often. I think about it often because when I meet small children in schools or my own nieces and nephews now, for them, it's almost normal to envisage that you could write a book and you could have your name on the cover. This is my Nisa Kama series, which I wrote for children. So you know, the idea is that when we write local, we're documenting our stories, but we're also giving our children the opportunity to say, this is something possible. This is something we can also do. If a small town girl from Petersburg wrote a book, then we can do it as well. So I hope that encourages more young writers.
Yes, yes, that's the story of hope is always enlightening and inspiring, and it's very. I think it's very dear to know. I'm from Limpopo as well. That a small girl from a small place in Limpopo wanted to be published, wanted to be an author, and it happened. As a
We've got
really
a lot of
good
talent
story.
here. We've got a lot of talent in Limpopo, I have to say.
Proud Limpopians here. And you're a sociologist. How is that really contributed towards your writing, the academic, I could say the academic discipline of it? How has it influenced your writing?
So, you know, being schooled as a social scientist obviously puts you into the discipline of writing in a very factual way. You're analyzing data, you're making observations around you. And so it is quite a leap when you take from writing the sort of factual analytical stuff and then trying to create fiction that still carries the same message of wanting to deal with certain social issues. And I'm glad that I challenged myself to do that, because my very first book was based on my thesis in sociology. It is called Daughters Are Diamonds, Honor, Shame, and Seclusion. And it looks at our sort of traditional cultures and the patriarchal basis of those cultures, and how women's lives are administered based on those cultures. And how that clashes with the fact that we live in a democratic space. We live with one of the most democratic constitutions. And so to navigate those experiences of what's allowed and what women believe is allowed, you know, that kind of dynamic, family honor and status, and how that challenges how women perceive themselves. So all of that comes through in my thesis. And then what I did with that is I began to write short stories on a blog. And my first novel coming out of that thesis was SoPhia, which looks at domestic violence. And the issue of domestic violence came out in so many of the interviews that I did at that time. So what I mean to say is that writing, and then writing fiction, taking that leap into writing fiction and creating characters that carry some of the themes we talk about, like domestic violence, was actually it was a vehicle for my social science work. It was a work, you know, it was how I was able to take my research and the sociological aspects of what I was observing and documenting, and putting them into stories that are more amenable, more palatable for an audience. So it's not just getting stuck on the library shelves, but saying, you know what, this is a way of generating a conversation. Let's get down and talk through stories. And this has been done over centuries, where stories help us to identify social ills and solutions, you know, because it creates a conversation. It allows us to sit around and say, but if this is going on, how do we solve this problem? And some of those problems are very particular to a certain community or our nation, or whatever the case might be. So in many ways, it's just extended my research to be able to write in different genres.
And I think it's safe to say that there's some breath of life in the books you've written, the breath of life in the stories you've told, simply because, like you have said, there are stories about um, societal ills that are affecting us. Just take us through some of these books. Just break down some of these books for us. how you've written them, and what are they challenging in our society today?
So, SoPhia, as I said, was the book on domestic violence, and what happened from there is not just the conversations that happened from there, but social science students at one of the universities used it as a text to understand some of the themes that develop around domestic violence in a household, how it affects children, where does it come from, and to try and unpack some of the themes. And so what they did is they developed a play for their class. This was second year students in 2013. And then I worked with Moments Entertainment, and we presented a theater play that was performed at the Pretoria State Theatre in 2014. And what we used that for was to bring audience members into the play. It's sort of a Brechtian theatre model that allows the book to be developed as a performance piece, but then it allows people that are sitting in the audience to give us their stories of abuse, their poems of abuse. And so it becomes this holistic model, like a healing circle, where people are talking about abuse and sharing their experiences and finding ways to transcend those experiences. So this is what happened with SoPhia. And after that, I continued to write short stories. So we developed a book, a collection called Belly of Fire, which is written by various activists. I just have one story in there. And we spoke about, we have a story about shack burnings in KwaZulu-Natal, which is still a big problem in our country. We have a story about child abuse. We have one story about a South African Jew who's reflecting about not wanting to move to Israel because he's not able to. He's got this dissonance with what's actually going on out there. The feeling of wanting to be there, but also not politically aligned with what's going on out there with this, and then there's a story on which is really comment on the Muslim marriages bill. So the idea that in polygamy, there's no transparency on the rights that women have within the situation, especially the right to inherit and the right, various rights and responsibilities upon them. So there's a lot of commentary that comes through these short stories. And then I wrote the Nisa Kamar series. Now, when I started writing the series, it was really like, a story of good versus evil, just trying to give a normal superhero, not even a superhero, the story of a young girl living in South Africa called Nisa Kamar. She's 10 years old. And I wanted a story that I could relate to when I was growing up, a story that I would have enjoyed reading. And this story has just grown in leaps and bounds. We'll be launching book 4 next month, just after the month of Ramadan. And it's had such impact on readers who grew up with me, because on the one hand, I'm writing about things I remember from my childhood, like, when there's Ramadan and everyone's outside on the streets looking for the moon, and there's aunties sending plates of samosas and pies between the houses, things like that. Or the simple reality of just being a child growing up in South Africa, and the same kind of issues that we might face of sitting in the classroom and getting called out to read something, or we all experience very similar kind of dramas in school. So I wanted to have a wholesome local story about a young girl growing up, and that's how this series of novels has developed, dealing along the way with social issues that face children, like bullying in the classroom, and racism and that sort of thing as well. And then in 2019, I finally published a novel that I'd been working on for a very long time, which is The Economics of Love and Happiness. And this looks at human trafficking in South Africa. Now, after the World Cup, I think our borders just became more porous and seen as a lucrative site to global traffickers who are looking for easy targets in a way, and taking children either off the streets or from the villages, or trying to intercept ways to take children out into Europe and to sell them in the sex trade. So The Economics of Love and Happiness, but in novel form, makes comment on that and tries to generate a discussion. So what you would have is an organization saying that they're a sports organization from Belgium, some grand kind of thing, in some cases, they would call themselves a church organization. And they go into the villages. And, if you're a family of like 8 or 9, and you have your child is getting an opportunity like a scholarship to go play soccer in Europe, and they say, we're going to pay for everything, but they give the family like 2,000 rand saying this is compensation. And they take that child, and the family never sees that child again. So what I'm saying is that this is a problem. This is one of the ways that children are trafficked out of our country, and the family doesn't have the resources to follow up, and they don't know what's happened to their child. They think their child has probably been given a good opportunity to play sport or to join a church organization in Europe or something like that. But the reality is that this is a big problem. So it's one of the things that I bring up in the novel, and it's just a way for our communities to keep more vigilant about where children are being taken off or taken to, and that sort of thing. So to answer your very earlier question, my writing is a form of activism. I hope that in a small way that I'm getting people to think about the kind of issues that we're dealing with, what we're faced with, young and old. And I'm finding that more and more young readers are asking questions. Children these days want to know, they want to be able to form their own opinions. So I'm hoping that my stories allow an opening for that as well.
Yes, I was just about to ask that you've written about South African democracy, you've written about transformation in South African society, you've written about sexism, sexual violence, and racism, you've written about Palestine as well. Is there a contradiction between the two where you become a professional writer, a professional author, a published author for that reason, and being an activist? Or there's no divide between the two?
I certainly hope not. I think that activism is also about creating awareness and raising voice for the voiceless. And if writing is able to do that in some small way, and if writing is able to lobby consciousness from and among people, then in some small way, I hope that I'm doing my part. And I remember a few years ago at the African Women's Conference, Nawal Sadawi was invited to speak, and it was hosted at WITS a few years ago. And one of the things she said that stayed with me, she said, "Don't consider yourself a writer until you've written against the powers that be, until you've challenged the powers that be, because then you're not actually doing anything with your writing." And so, in many ways, writing is not frivolous. It's not a frivolous activity. It's always been the oral narrative and the written narrative have always been forms of activism in their own way, because they are raising consciousness. It's impossible to think that any form of writing is not able to engage some feeling in a person, to wake up something inside of you. And another thing she said at the time, I remember clearly, is don't consider yourself a writer if you haven't been in jail. And what it really drove home was the idea that you would be jailed for your convictions if it was a thorn in the side of the state that you were writing against. And not even to take for granted that living in a democracy means that you can't challenge that democracy. Because if your writing is not able to challenge every little last nook and cranny of social ills, and if you're not stepping on toes, because, I mean, for example, we're dealing with large-scale corruption in this country right now. And if we're not able to speak up and write up about that and appeal to those with conscience within the structures, then we're not actually, as writers, what are we really doing? As artists, what are we really doing with the short time that we have?
And just listening to some of the inspiration or some of the reasons why you write, you would say that your work, although is fiction in the novels, or in inverted commas, it is a product of your own surroundings. It's a product of what you consume in society, what you watch on the news, what you read in the newspapers. So the work that you do, would you say, as it is fiction, but it's a result of your own realities around you.
What I found with fiction is that it's easier to sit around the table and read stories and absorb them and have a conversation about them. So it's one thing to write journal articles which are necessary to give people information. It's one thing to analyze data in the social sciences where you want to test the incidence of something happening and how prevalent something is. So we can look at stats and data on the one hand, but people don't always want to consume stats and data. And so the power of putting something into a novel and creating characters that actually form moving pictures inside a person's mind when they're reading cannot be underestimated. And it's a big leap. It's two-dimensional to be able to write and analyze on a page. As soon as you start to create characters that have feelings and that evoke emotions in your reader, you're dealing with a very different dimension of writing, and it takes more out of you as a writer, but it's also much more satisfying. So when you talk about writing from observation, yes, to some degree, even standing in a bus queue or standing in a supermarket queue these days as a writer, as an artist, you can tell a story just by looking at what a person has in their shopping basket and what they're wearing and how they carry themselves. And I listen to how people um, speak to each other. Their intonations, the choice of words tells you a lot about a person, you know. And so those are things that you definitely look out for. But as far as the data, on the one hand, while we are getting information through the news and the media, and we've got information coming at us from all dimensions, it does take research when you're writing about domestic violence or when you're writing about human trafficking, just to get things right. And so that's the aspect where the social sciences comes into the creative field, bringing the two together to create those stories.
And we, like you were saying before, that you're not a writer until you're jailed or something like that. We've seen historically how literature has helped to build society, but at the same time, literature has also helped to destroy society. We've seen this in Nazi Germany. We've seen this in apartheid South Africa. We are seeing it now in apartheid Israel, where Palestinian writers are banished, they're jailed for writing about their realities. How do we preserve progressive literature? I know you spoke about how your parents encouraged you to read while you were young. But as a society, how do we preserve progressive literature amongst ourselves?
From an individual level, I think that our sphere of influence is within the family and encouraging younger readers, and keeping, little libraries together where, not just in our homes, but in our communities. But it would be such a great sort of treasure if our Department of Arts and Culture was greater involved in preserving progressive literature, as you say, because there's a lot of literature that is currently being produced as well, locally produced material that is still not given the leverage across the board from so many ways. So just a few days ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Ismail Mohammed from the Center for Creative Arts at UKZN, and we just happened to speak about the problem right now where funding has gone missing, has been mismanaged, which was laid aside as a disaster relief fund during COVID for artists. That's 300 million rand that can't be accounted for. And I'm making this point only because, look, this is money not only that will help artists, that will keep the arts alive during a pandemic, but also if there's a commitment from the powers that be, so to speak, from government, towards both our locally produced literature and creating these hives of both creating and looking after what is available, the material, the progressive material, the books, will definitely benefit in the future as well. So I think that there has to be more conscientizing of just the importance of this material, of this literature. Our literature is political. It has the ability to inform. It has the ability to, like we said, keep us on our best of intentions for creating a better community, for creating leaders of tomorrow. And we can't underestimate that. It's just that we need more resource. And in the meantime, resource is slipping through the drains of corruption. And it's actually very frustrating to see that happen.
And I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's in Palestine, how young writers, and I'll say young writers because I think that's where the minds are being creative. They're finding new ways of providing literature. We've seen students in Palestine being arrested for distributing flyers. We've seen young activists being arrested because of a Facebook post. And these are young creatives, these are young artists who are finding it extremely very much difficult to produce literature, to produce stories of fiction that will inspire families, stories of Palestinian realities and liberation that would inspire the next generation and the next generations after them. Finding it extremely difficult to write. So what message would you have to young Palestinians today in university campuses, in high schools that are really finding it hard to get that basic motivations to write?
We have to read, we read and we observe around us. And I think the most important thing to write about writing is to find your own writer's voice, to find your inner voice, and not to just think that you're going to be, the first thing you write is going to be like this great groundbreaking thing. So stop judging, put your pen down and just write and see what comes up. I think that's important. Writing can be a very healing process. So even if you're writing just for yourself, it's something that can be very special and motivating. I don't know if you've heard of something they call it the morning papers, where the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning is write the first thing that comes to your mind, even if it's just for 4 or 5 minutes. And you collect that diary every single day, and you'll be fascinated about how that helps you discipline yourself as a writer, and how that allows you to develop your voice as a writer. So that's a wonderful way to get into writing and to have a better understanding of your own mindset, your own self. And the other thing is that, we talk about songs and lyrics like Tracy Chapman and Bob Marley and so many others who have written about the politics of their time. And the power came from what they observed and how they felt and how they processed both of that. So our young people have that potential to tap into what you're feeling and how you're experiencing your environment. Just write about that without judgment. And don't underestimate the power of how that'll connect you. Because when you share written emotion, it has a different level of power to connect with people around you, people your age, older people like myself who want to read about that vibrancy of being young and being, opening your eyes and awakening to your political consciousness. And I think that there's a lot to be had if our young people just stop judging and keep writing, put their pen down and write.
Great. Shafinaaz, thank you very much for joining our webinar series. We really do appreciate the different voice that you bring on the issue of activism and being an author. We really do appreciate it. Shafinaaz is on Instagram, she's on Twitter, and she's on Facebook as well. What we know is that people might have follow-up questions when watching this webinar series. You can contact her there. She's very, very quick to respond, I might tell you that. And her books are also on sale. So follow her on her socials and you will be able to get information of how to get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of her published work. This video will remain on our Facebook page under the videos. It will remain on our YouTube channel under our videos. So for future reference, people can check it there as well. Shafinaaz, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Ali. Such a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you again and good night.